Well, thank you for joining us today for our 13th Federal Forum. And before I go on, I just want to take an opportunity to recognize a few senior administrators that we have in the room. Audrey Anderson, our General Counsel, is here. We have two deans with us today, Linda Norman, the Dean of the School of Nursing, and John Sloop, the Dean of College of Arts and Science. So thank you all for being here, and particularly thank you, Audrey and John and Linda, for joining us. Now, these forums we've been doing for quite a while now. As I said, this is our 13th one, and they're hosted by our Office of Federal Relations in Washington, D.C., which is headed up by Christina West, who is no stranger to any of you here today. The forums are a way for us to highlight some of the pressing federal issues facing research universities. I also want to introduce the newest member of our Federal Relations team, Gabriella Ramanan, back up there, who joined us in September as our Assistant Director of Federal Relations. Prior to joining Christina's team, Gabriella worked on the policy staff of the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, which she handled NASA and other research policy issues. She received her undergraduate degree from Brown University, and we're very excited to having her work in our office in Washington. Welcome, Gabriella. Now, this is the second time that we've partnered on a forum with our political science department, and we're very excited to do so again. Associate Professor Alan Wiseman is joining us today to discuss his latest research, which measures the effectiveness of Congress. While many of us may have an instinctual reaction to the issue of congressional effectiveness or lack thereof, Alan and his colleagues have developed a way to actually measure federal lawmakers' effectiveness. His recently released book, Legislative Effectiveness in the United States Congress, The Lawmakers, provides a wealth of information on the effectiveness of members of Congress. The book covers 1973 to 2008, while the companion website has been updated to 2012. And it's a very fun website to go on and play with. I urge you to do so if you haven't already. Alan is going to speak today about the recent midterm election from the point of view of his research. Following Alan, we'll hear from our Office of Federal Relations. First, Associate Director of Federal Relations, Alex Curry, is going to break down the midterms to remind us not only of what happened in November, but why. For those of you who don't know Alex, he primarily handles our health policy and biomedical research federal advocacy portfolio, working closely with leadership both at the Medical Center as well as the schools of medicine and nursing to support agencies such as NIH and programs such as graduate medical education. Prior to joining Vanderbilt nearly 2 years ago, Alex handled healthcare issues for former Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana. Finally, Christina West, our Assistant Vice Chancellor for Federal Relations, is going to give us an overview of what Congress accomplished or didn't in the so-called lame duck session that wrapped up last week, and she'll give us a preview of what's ahead for Republican-controlled 114th Congress next year. Christina reminds me that lest we forget, the 2016 elections are a mere 694 days away. Before we get started, I just want to emphasize, as always, that we hope these forums start a discussion. We want to hear from you, and we've left plenty of time at the end for questions and a conversation, so please speak up. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alan.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I realize, of course, there's no monitor here, so I'm just going to wander to the side rather than just mindlessly imagine I know what I'm saying behind me. As that said, I wanted to talk today a bit about the way I see what's been going on over the last few weeks and likely coming to the next couple of years from not only the perspective of a political scientist, but one that studied Congress for my professional career, and most recently from one who's trying to really get a sense of the ways in which individual members of Congress really vary in terms of the relative effectiveness of getting bills through the legislative process. So for those of you who are watching the recent congressional elections of interest, obviously immediately following the elections, we saw a variety of headlines in all forms of media, such as Republicans seized control of the Senate, gained full control of Congress. And the obvious first take that many people argued was that given that we now have a very strong Republican control of both the House and the Senate, combined with President Obama in the White House for another 2 years, we essentially expected the gridlock 2.0 ensuing. And this seems to be very much a natural response of members of the press, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this a bit today when the other panelists speak about what they think is likely to occur, or perhaps not occur in the next session. That being said, from my perspective and my co-author, Craig Bolden at the University of Virginia, we think that the extent to which much political rhetoric and media has focused quite a bit on the scope of quote-unquote polarization in the legislature really is essentially too narrow of a view of what's going on. At the end of the day, we essentially view members of Congress being elected to be lawmakers. Whether or not they are lawmakers is an open question. But it's fair to argue that they vary pretty substantially on the ability, either perceived or real, to get bills through the legislative process from introductions to ultimately, in certain lucky cases, being signed into law. So what Craig and I have done most recently is we've essentially tried to understand why are members of Congress more effective than others, what perhaps explains this level of variation across members and their ability to move bills to the legislative process. As Beth noted, we've recently published a book on the topic, perfect stocking stuffer if you like. Also available in various e-formats. And from our perspective, really the goal of this project is not only to engage these broad questions about why are some members of Congress more effective lawmakers than others, as well as trying to understand what this means for, essentially the efficacy of Congress to engage various policy topics. But we're hoping this actually allows us to some degree, redirect scholarly discussions, which have been focusing thus far largely on why isn't our polarized. I mean, these are interesting, important questions, but ultimately it seems that by just accepting polarization as rich rather than thinking about the likely consequences of it for individual members, we're really missing quite a bit in terms of trying to understand what's happening in the United States. And as Beth noted, we also have a companion website to the book that actually updates the data through 2012, so that'd be the conclusion of the 112th Congress. So that's the one directly before the one that's currently about to wrap up, in which anyone of the general public, including yourself, can essentially access our data, and we have a very nice interface with which you can identify individual members' legislative effectiveness scores, which I'll describe in just one second. And the goal of this is ideally, hopefully, to have individual citizens, members of the public, the journalistic community, and the like, get a sense of what we mean by the concept of legislative effectiveness, and once again, will provide us and us as a community broadly with the opportunity to really get a sense of what's going on in the House. And I say that as a side note, we only focus on the U.S. House, for reasons I'm happy to talk about a bit later. So the broad point of where I'm coming from is that I argue that individual legislative effectiveness can in fact be measured systematically. We all, in our hearts, probably feel that some members are good or bad at moving bills through the process, but data can tell us quite a bit. So for every member of Congress from 1973 up until 2012, we've identified how many bills they introduced in a given Congress, how many of those bills received any sort of action in committee, how many of them received any kind of action beyond committee, such as being reported from committee or floor votes, how many of those passed the House, and ultimately how many of those were signed into law. Given that data, then, we essentially upgrade bills that are deemed by journalists to be substantive and significant, and we essentially downgrade bills that are obviously commemorative in nature, such as, literally the renaming of the post office or the striking of coins, for example. And given this data, then we're able to come up with a summary measure that we refer to as the legislative effectiveness score, which for any member of Congress, we can identify within a 2-year period how effective, or quote-unquote effective, but essentially how successful they were in moving their legislative agenda items from introduction through the process in comparison to all other members of the House during that 2-year period after we've adjusted these bills for substantive significance. And having taken these legislative effectiveness scores, we then try to see what explains the degree of variation we see in the data. On its face, it seems to pass the sniff test in the sense that members of the majority party are notably more effective in our metric than members of the minority party, which is what you'd expect given the majority party controls the chamber by definition. We also find that seniority matters in ways you'd expect. The more senior you are, you tend to be more effective in our metric than those that are freshmen or newly elected. And obviously, individuals who hold committee chairs or subcommittee chairs are notably more effective in our metric than rank and file members of the House. That being said, we also find that legislative effectiveness scores are highly informative. So if we take a look at where someone is in the freshman cohort in the respective party, if they're essentially highly effective or relatively ineffective in the freshman cohort, we find this predicts pretty nicely their likelihood of running for higher office and perhaps ultimately running for presidency, for example. Likewise, those members who are relatively ineffective in the freshman cohort, they're not successful in getting bills to the process at all, we find this is highly correlated with voluntary to actually leave office. Okay, these people choose not to stand for re-election within a 10-year period after being first elected to Congress. Beyond this point, we have a variety of other findings focusing on the roles of parties and committees, Southern Democrats, which might be of interest to people in this room, the role of African-American legislators in the House over the last 30, actually going on 40 years now, as well as the ways in which individual members of Congress and their relative level of effectiveness contribute to various types of policy gridlock in specific policy areas. Also, as some of you know, because I've corresponded with some of you, one of the findings that received a bit of press attention is something that we identified in terms of the stark difference in gender between men and women in the House. On its face, it appears that women are more effective than male members of the House, having control for other features. And we find that this general benefit to females, so to speak, is largely driven by women in the minority party. So another way of thinking about this is minority party women are notably more effective than minority party men at moving bills through the legislative process. This received quite a bit of attention. My own personal accomplishment, I never thought my work would be quoted in Self magazine, but I've always had a dream. But essentially, our data analysis suggests, or is consistent with the arguments, that there tends to be notably different legislative style and negotiating and bargaining style between women and men, such that women tend to be generally more inclusive and essentially try to strive for some sort of in-the-middle agreements rather than a complete zero-sum winner-take-all competition. Unlike men, these types of skills seem to work or seem to advance the legislative bills or legislative agendas notably further in women in the minority party, whereas, broadly speaking, men in the minority party tend to engage in bomb throwing. They stop introducing legislation compared to when they're in the majority. Women do not do that, and their strategies seem to serve them well. Now that said, and obviously, given the stickers we heard initially when Beth introduced this project, many people would argue there seems to be something wrong with Congress, and public opinion would suggest this holds. So this is essentially a nice summary measure of public opinion polls from 2008 up until 2014. Congressional job approval is very, 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 very low, that being around 12.7, and that being average, and actually it was around 9.2 at one point earlier this year. And congressional disapproval is relatively high. We all know this, it's discussed quite often. But if we take a look about the ways in which political leaders historically have referred to lawmaking institutions, this is a quote by Clinton, which was more or less echoing an earlier quote almost verbatim by Eisenhower. When he said, "There's nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America." So we have presidents, both Republican and Democrat, embracing the same notion. And it's also fair to argue that many Americans, at least when asked openly about this claim, they desire a compromise, contrary to the way it's being portrayed by the political leaders. So according to a recent Gallup poll, approximately 53% say leaders essentially should compromise rather than sticking to their principles, compared to 25% that are in favor of integrity of principles without compromise. So the question becomes then, who are the highly effective lawmakers? Just in the most recent Congress, 112. Some of the names seem pretty straightforward, pretty unsurprising to members or individuals who follow Congress. Young from Alaska, this is the person who was responsible for building the bridge to nowhere, so imagine how effective he could be when he's actually in power. We have some members of the Florida delegation that are quite interesting. Darrell Issa, California, who is well known for very adversarial investigations. Independent of that, it's also clear he's quite successful in getting legislation through the legislative process. Members of the Democratic Party that shine pretty nicely, Carolyn Maloney from New York, who's been quite influential in advancing financial services reforms, both when she's in the majority as well as minority party, as well as Maxine Waters from California. These are just a random sample of relatively timely members. So it's fair to argue these individuals can help overcome gridlock. There's a variety of habits that we point to in the book that might explain the ways in which highly effective members of Congress are able to actually overcome gridlock across their career. To some degree, they focus on individual tactics aimed at specialization. So habit one suggests that individual members of Congress are able to develop a legislative agenda that clearly comports their personal experiences, tend to be more successful in moving their bills through the process. Likewise, individuals such as Representative Young, Congressman Young from Alaska, who tend to develop a legislative agenda that's highly related or highly correlated with their constituencies' needs, they tend to be highly successful. Individuals that are very entrepreneurial for positions of power, and by that I mean they essentially only introduce legislation that's likely to go through their own committees of jurisdiction, they tend to be highly successful. Individuals who, for lack of a better phrase, tend to be nice, they're actually willing to reach out and compromise, and even though in recent Congresses people would argue habit 4 tends to be non-existent, we can still point to a handful of members who have been relatively successful in recent Congresses by clearly forging bipartisan coalitions on their legislation. And then finally, it's clear that some members of Congress have been highly successful because they've been able to cultivate a broad set of allies outside of the chamber, meaning in the Senate and the White House at the time they're actually introducing legislation, and this is serving them well. So, with that as a broader overview for what's going on, this begs the question, how does effectiveness relate to who's actually going to be in Congress? It's interesting to note, if you take a look at our data and think about individuals who are in Congress starting in 2010, 2008, and 2006, so the 3 Congresses before the previous one, okay? And we identify those individuals who essentially were, quote unquote, consistently effective, meaning that their legislative effectiveness scores were consistently above what we expect them to be, so to speak, given their relative seniority, whether or not they're in the majority party or whether or not they held committee chairs. We find that these 46 consistently effective members, a small sample of them decided to seek higher office at times. Some of them were successful. A very small sample of them had actually resigned or retired before these current elections. A very small sample of them actually lost in 2012. So when they stood for re-election in 2012, they lost. But that being said, of these 46 consistently effective members, the 27 that were still around as of 6 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago, pardon me, were running for re-election, all of them were re-elected. So the most highly effective members of the House that have a track record for this are all returning to the House. So that suggests that there's room for optimism if we want to think about who could potentially be a legislative leader in the next Congress. That being said, without naming any names, there's a handful of those that were ineffective. 35 members of Congress were consistently ineffective across the 3 previous Congresses to stand for re-election. And by that I mean they essentially were introducing very little, or what they're introducing was basically going nowhere, is being pigeonholed in committee. And of these individuals, 2 of them had sought higher office previously, 6 had resigned or retired. 4 of them had lost in 2012, but essentially everyone that stood for re-election in 2014 was re-elected. So we have many effective members returning, and we have many people who have an unambiguous track record of being mindlessly ineffective who are also returning, so bully for us. Now that being said, one interesting point that people have been thinking about is the large number of individuals we have in the Senate starting the next Congress that have previous House experience. So as an interesting side note, we currently have 53 former House members that are either sitting or going to be sitting in the Senate coming in January. This is the largest number of previous House members in the Senate since the 19th century, so this is more or less the high watermark. Some people have actually argued this is going to be a problem in terms of exacerbating underlying partisan tensions because they believe that what they refer to as essentially the Gingrich effect is going to carry over to the Senate, where we'll have highly contentious politics. But it's interesting to note that of those 53 former House members, according to our data, 37 of them were essentially consistently effective across Congresses, and especially the most recent Congress they were in, probably the most recent House they were in before elected to the Senate. So even though there might be the possibility of partisan rancor in the Senate, there's still a substantial number of individuals who had a strong track record of being effective lawmakers before coming into this new institution. 2 individuals who are coming into the Senate were just recently elected into the House, so I have no data on them, so to speak. I have no clue what they were like, but if you check back in 6 months, I'll have their scores calculated. That being said, the individuals that are currently in the Senate are going to be in the Senate. There's a substantial body of them that unambiguously exceeded what their expectations were, what their baseline legislative effectiveness scores should have been when they were in the House. And some of these are individuals whose names are quite familiar to all of us. Kane, Kulski, Gardner, who's relatively new, of course, but Udall from New Mexico. So some of these were legislative powerhouses when they were in the House, and they, to some degree, have actually expanded their track record in the Senate. With regards to freshmen, we obviously have a lot of freshmen in the U.S. House. It's not entirely clear what's going to happen to them yet, given various caucus battles, but clearly there's dozens of new opportunities for individuals to pave the way for careers involving effective lawmaking. And speaking personally, I'm looking forward to seeing what the future holds. So with that, I'll turn it over to people who actually know things about legislation. So.
All right, so I had the great pleasure of walking us through a bit of a post-mortem of the midterm elections that occurred last month. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the committee leadership and floor leadership, what's changed, what's stayed the same, and also talk through some of the reasons, as we see it, Christina and I, the outcome electorally. So first, let's start with a very quick review of the current Congress, which is actually still in session, is the Senate is in session, and Christina will probably touch on the length of experience. But this is the balance of power as it's been over the last 2 years. As you can see, and all of you I think probably know, Democrats have maintained control of the Senate since 2006. They had a majority of 55 of 45 Republican votes. Two of those 55 members of the Democratic caucus are actually independents, but they caucus with the Democrats. On the House side, as you know, since the 2010 wave elections, Republicans have been in the majority, consistently increased their majorities. In fact, at this point, after the midterm elections, they'll have the largest majority over their Democratic counterparts since early in the 20th century. So, let's start with the obvious, with the new Congress that will be convening in January, and that is that Republicans won big. You all know this. It was expected that they were going to win. The question was just how big they were going to win. So just as far as who these folks are, they're probably familiar faces. Up here in the top left, we've got the current majority leader of the Senate, Harry Reid from Nevada, who will soon be the minority leader of the Senate. President Nancy Pelosi, who was one-time Speaker of the House, now the minority leader in the House. On the left, of course, we've got John Boehner, the current Speaker, will be Speaker again next year. And the happiest man in Washington, although you never see him smiling. This is the happiest photo you can possibly find of Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, who won a re-election and also won the job of his dreams, which is to be majority leader of the Senate. So these are the races that were in play in the Senate. And I'll probably spend a little more time talking about the Senate and the House, because that was where, of course, the change in majority was. That's where all the action, that's where most of the news media attention was. So there was, by conventional wisdom, about 13 seats that were highly contested. This is an outline of those 13. And as you can see, they're mainly red. That's because Republicans pretty much swept. They needed to pick up 6 seats to take the majority. They actually picked up 9. Just a couple months prior to the November elections, I think depending on the different pollsters you were looking at, we're saying it's a 50% chance whether or not Republicans would pick up the majority. That would be just 6 seats, and obviously they did quite well. Just highlighting a couple of these races, and even some of the blue that stayed Democratic, like Virginia, these were incredibly close. In Virginia, Gillespie, I mean, it was within 1 percentage point at the end of the day. New Hampshire ended up, Senator Shaheen maintained that seat, but it was a very uncomfortable race. And while CNN and others called it early in the evening, and they were kind of walking back from that because it looked like that there was a late surge in some Republican counties there. So the fact that they held on, they claimed that New Hampshire, the Democrats, was a great victory for them in a very dark year, but the fact that that was one of the few places that they could really claim victory is certainly noteworthy. I should mention that on this particular graphic, Louisiana is gray. That has now turned red, so that is another one in the Republican column after a runoff there. This is another map. This shows actually all of the races that were up. So of course the Senate, unlike the House, having 6-year terms, they stagger them every 2 years, so you have roughly a third of the Senate up in any given election cycle. So these are all of the races. Many of them, because of the dynamics in those states, are not terribly competitive, and in some cases you don't even have the other party putting up a major candidate. The orange are the states. I don't know why National Journal chose orange. I think it's kind of a strange color choice, but those are the states that Democrats had going into this election and held. The bright red ones are the states that Republicans did not have, and they picked up. So actually, before I go on and talk about the House, I'll give you a few statistics, and that is that there are 13 freshmen that are coming into the Senate. Many of those members, as Alan mentioned, are actually experienced current members of the House. Of those 13 members, 12 of the freshmen are Republicans. So almost all of the new guys in town on the Senate side are Republicans. The new senator on the Democratic ranks is from Michigan, retiring Carl Levin's seat. The median age in the Senate will now be 61, with the youngest member being Tom Cotton, who's 37 years old, and the oldest member is Dianne Feinstein from California, 81 years of age. I just find this statistic mind-blowing. So I mentioned, of course, that the senators have a 6-year term. With the start of the 114th Congress in January, 47% of the sitting senators will have served for a term or less than 6 years, 6 years or less. Almost half of the Senate have not been around for an entire term, which, when you think of the Senate historically, is the kind of body of statesmen that have the institutional knowledge and have been working in policy throughout their careers. This is kind of a different view. Of course, many of these folks have served in other capacities in the administration, in some administration, in the House, or back in state offices. Turning to the House of Representatives, because we don't want to leave them out of this picture, you'll see as I click here, the next map looks pretty red. This is our country with respect to House districts. So it's certainly a truism to say that Democratic power bases continue to be focused in the urban centers in the country. And this is certainly reflective of gerrymandering and those kinds of policies. You'll see the numbers. The Republicans now have 247 of 435 votes, and Democrats only have 188. So the largest majority, there's the statistic I gave before, since 1928. Moving along, these are some statistics about the new members. I mentioned that the 13 in the Senate side. There's, on the House side, 41 Republican freshmen, 17 Democratic freshmen. You can see some breakdown. There's 11 new women in both chambers combined, 5 new African Americans, 3 Hispanics, 2 Asian Americans. And turning to the kind of big dogs, the guys who run the committee structure, at least in the House, these are all, you see a theme here? It's very diverse, isn't it? So there's been a lot of discussion, especially with respect to immigration politics, that the Republican Party needs to embrace a more diverse picture of themselves and candidates, but also electorate. That's certainly not being borne out in their top leadership. As you can see here, one woman, she is the chairman, Candace Miller is the chair of the House Administration Committee. Just to highlight a couple of these guys that you may know. So Hal Rogers from Kentucky is going to continue to be the chair of the Appropriations Committee in the House. Tom Price from Georgia is very excited to take over the Budget Committee, which is a very important committee, as you probably know. Paul Ryan, of course, used the platform of the Budget Committee to become very well known, and he got a VP nod because of that. Fred Upton will be the chairman again of the Energy and Commerce Committee. So Marshall Blackburn from Tennessee is the vice chair of that committee, will continue to be the vice chair, we understand. Lamar Smith is the chairman of the Commerce Committee. That will not change next Congress. And Paul Ryan, who I just mentioned, is getting a new job as the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which does a lot of tax policy, also some healthcare spending issues with respect to Medicare. And I think that's it. So as far as some of the floor leadership, we talked about already, of course, that Mitch McConnell is going to become the majority leader of the Senate. He's already indicated that he's going to run the Senate much different than his predecessor, Harry Reid, who will be the minority leader on the Democratic side. I've highlighted here our 2 Tennessee senators, who, as you might know, were ranking members, the top Republicans of 2 A or top level committees in the Senate, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee. So both of our members, Senator Alexander will become the chair of the Health Committee, and Senator Corker will become the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. On the House side, we've covered most of these, and I've highlighted some of these numbers here. So why was this a wave election, if we can call it that? Well, here's some of our thinking about it. We knew going in that Democrats had a very tough cycle. This was just, politics aside, they were defending far more seats on the Senate side. We kind of looked at the map as far as what were going to be competitive races. Interestingly enough, this dynamic switches next cycle. So in 2016, Republicans will be defending far more current incumbent seats than their Democratic allies. So there's already kind of a thought that in the Republican caucus in the Senate, we might only have this majority for 2 years, so let's make sure we use it as we want, because this could very quickly turn hands again. Popularity of the president certainly played in to a number of these races. I'm going to end my little remarks with a quick little clip from the campaign trail, and you'll see that I think the president has been used in many of these campaigns this past year. Certainly he was not being asked by many of his Democratic colleagues out onto the campaign trail. In the Louisiana Senate race that we talked about briefly, the approval rating among white voters was something like 15–17% of the president. So this definitely was a poll on a lot of Democrats seeking office this year. Thirdly and lastly, in our analysis, and this was born out actually of what Alan mentioned, is Republicans were seen to have recruited a better stable of candidates this year. You didn't have as many kind of bomb throwers coming out of primary elections on the Republican side. I think Republican establishment types very early on in the cycle got very heavily involved in recruiting what they thought were business-friendly candidates, and that certainly made the general election process a little easier for them. So final slide before I give you those two quick video clips, and this is just a show of all the freshman senators and the lone Democrat there from Michigan. All the rest are Republicans. And this, you can maybe see, I understand that the type's a little small, but just to show you some of the backgrounds that these folks are coming from. And they are seen as fairly establishment types. So they've come from positions of state government. Many of them were state lawmakers. And we have a couple people who were formerly in the Bush administration. So these are not newbies to Washington necessarily, although of course when they're talking to the electorate back home, they're outsider candidates and going to go to Washington to change things. To that point, this is one of my favorite clips of campaign season. Oh, wait.
Castrating hogs on an Iowa farm. So when I get to Washington, I'll know how to cut pork.
Joni Ernst, mother, soldier, conservative.
My parents taught us to live within our means. It's time to force Washington to do the same. To cut wasteful spending, repeal Obamacare, and balance the budget. I'm Joni Ernst, and I approve this message because Washington's full of big spenders. Let's make them squeal.
So, apparently it turned out to be an effective message in Iowa because Joni Ernst is headed to Washington and instead of inspiring.
Thanks to all of you, we are heading to Washington. And we are going to make them squeal. Thank you.
So that's all I have.
So, on that note, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the lame duck session, and I realized as Beth was giving her introduction that this is what happens when you write your boss's talking points the week before, and you expect the lame duck will have wrapped up by the time she's giving the talking points. Lo and behold, that did not happen because the lame duck is continuing this week with the Senate still in session, much to their chagrin, I think. So, what are they working on? There's been a slew of kind of buckets of issues that the lame duck has had on their plate over the past couple of months. And I thought I'd start with nominations because actually that has proven to be a fairly substantial issue, particularly going into this week. It was a high priority for Senate Democrats to push through as many nominations as they possibly could before they lose the majority at the end of this Congress. Needless to say, pushing through administration nominations will probably not be a terribly high priority for a Republican Senate beginning next year. So, and there are hundreds of nominations that are waiting to be considered by the Senate. There were 144 nominations that have been passed out of committees and are pending confirmation. As of late last week, there were 47 executive and 16 judicial branch nominations that were approved just in the lame duck session. There's two big ones that are out there that they knew as soon as they were announced were not going to make it through the lame duck, and that would be the Attorney General and the Secretary of Defense. So those will be two nominations, and indications are that there isn't a lot of opposition to those individuals that have been named for those positions. There will likely be a lot of scrutiny around the Department of Justice and the Pentagon, but not likely around those individuals. But those are not on the slate to be considered for the lame duck. So kind of backing up a little bit, what has broken some of the floodgates open, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, was some activity around the omnibus appropriation spending bill. And over the weekend, Senator Lee and Senator Cruz made a number of procedural moves around the omnibus that effectively opened the door for Majority Leader Reid to push through dozens of more nominations than the Senate had expected to be able to consider. So there are as many as 24 nominees that will likely make it across the finish line by the end of this week that was not expected to happen. And a number of them, frankly, are nominees that have significant Republican opposition. One in particular being the Surgeon General, who was confirmed yesterday. There was only one Republican senator that supported that nominee. That was Senator Kirk from Illinois. Most people assumed that that was going to be dead at the end of this year. And lo and behold, some political maneuvering has backfired. And frankly, a number of Senator Lee and Senator Cruz's Republican colleagues have been very critical of what they did over the weekend that allowed this to happen. So there's a lot of things, of big things that have gotten attention and are getting attention that the lame duck Congress is considering last month and this month. But there's a very long list of bills that have passed completely under the radar through a procedural mechanism in the Senate known as unanimous consent, which means that if a bill has the unanimous approval verbally of the Senate, then they can bypass voting on it, and it simply moves on and is considered passed through a unanimous consent. The power of the Senate, though, is that any single senator can block a unanimous consent agreement and prevent a bill from moving. So this is just a sampling of some of the things that have passed without a lot of media attention, some of which are pretty significant, and others of which, naming lots of post offices, probably less significant. So other things, before we get to the really big one, that this lame duck has considered. The first would be the Defense Authorization Bill. This is a bill that sets policy priorities and authorizes spending levels for the Department of Defense. It's typically seen as a must-pass bill, and in fact has passed on a bipartisan basis for each of the last 50+ years. So everyone knew that this was likely going to get done. It's just a matter of getting it across the finish line. It does, from a Vanderbilt perspective, have a couple of things of interest to us because it does authorize spending levels for things like defense research programs, and it does include some language this year that the higher ed community worked on around proof of concept center and technology transfer language for a pilot program. Tax extenders is one that I really wish I could say has been a major priority and is now done. That's likely to be the last bill that the Senate considers. But there's been a lot of debate over the past year around tax reform. You may remember that the House released a massive proposal to overhaul all of both individual and corporate taxes. Typically, Congress does this so-called extension bill each year that will extend expiring provisions for 1 or 2 years, sort of on an ad hoc rolling basis. There was a lot of back and forth between the House and the Senate. We have provisions that expired at the end of 2013. We have provisions that are expiring at the end of 2014. Are we doing a 1 year of just what has already expired? Are we doing 2 year? Are we making some of these permanent? Lots of different priorities and preferences in that. And of course, where Congress came down was the lowest common denominator of simply creating and in the House passing a bill for a one-year extension of the tax provisions that already expired at the end of 2013. So when that eventually does pass the Senate, which it will probably today or tomorrow, it will simply extend those provisions for, 2.5 weeks before they're then expired once again. There are a couple provisions in that bill that are of interest to the higher ed community, including the ability to deduct tuition, as well as the IRA charitable rollover, which allows certain individuals to make charitable contributions out of their IRA. There were some efforts to make things permanent. The American Opportunity Tax Credit, which is another one that benefits students and families, was potentially in the mix as something to be made permanent. Democrats in the White House have really opposed that because their argument being that the tax bills have never been paid for, and they oppose making tax provisions permanent that aren't paid for. So we're left with a one-year extension of tax provisions that already expired at the end of last year. The Terrorism Risk Insurance Act is another one that the business community sees as a must-pass bill. That's also being held up in the Senate right now, and through objections from Senator Lee, Senator Cruz, Senator Coburn, and some of the other usual suspects, but is also likely to pass before the Senate finishes its work. So there were also a number of things where they attempted to get something done during the lame duck session and came up short. Perhaps one of the most noteworthy and directly, overtly campaign-related item was the Keystone Pipeline vote, which very quickly became a priority for Louisiana Senate candidates who were in a runoff, and each had the same bill, one Congressman Cassidy in the House and Senator Landrieu in the Senate, and miraculously somehow they found time to have votes on both of those bills. Passed the House, died in the Senate, did not receive the number of votes it needed in order to pass, so didn't really get anywhere, and certainly ultimately did not help Senator Landrieu in that runoff. Chairman Harkin released a revised higher education reauthorization bill a couple weeks ago. Really interesting, since Chairman Harkin not only would be losing his chairmanship position next year, but in fact is retiring at the end of this year. So sort of his swan song of ideas around how to reauthorize the Higher Education Act. On the House side, the Ways and Means Republican staff released a draft package of hospital-related provisions, many of which Alex has worked on for a long time and that are things of interest to Vanderbilt. The Institute of Education Sciences was up for reauthorization and in fact had a bill that was passed out of the House and approved by the Senate committee, and there was very much an effort to try and get that across the finish line, and that got held up. And Children's Health Insurance Program is also something that retiring Senator Jay Rockefeller from West Virginia really wanted to try and push through in the lame duck session, and just not able to do it. So, some of the big things. So we had an executive order that the president released just before Thanksgiving related to immigration, which effectively, and this is a quote from basically a number of Republicans, poisoned the well in terms of the goodwill and the working relationship between the administration and the Congress. I think it's safe to say that the executive order thoroughly pleased no one. For those on the right, the mere fact that the president went and did an executive order, they found highly offensive and strongly opposed. Frankly, a lot of Democrats also were opposed to what the president did because they felt it did not go far enough. The executive order does have a few provisions that impact research universities, expanding the deferred action, the so-called DREAMer students, expanded that program a little bit, and as well it expanded the optional practical training that some of our international students are eligible for. So some Republicans have taken a short-term response to that, some have a more longer-term view. The ones with a longer-term view have been pushing for the House to take up some form of immigration reform legislation, which they have yet to do. The short-term response is what's sort of thrown a monkey wrench into how the omnibus appropriations bill has worked out. And I would note, if anyone did not see the Saturday Night Live video around their Schoolhouse Rock version of the Immigration Executive Order, I highly recommend taking a look at it. So the one must-pass bill that Congress has is to fund the government. And just to remind you, we did face, Congress passed back in September, way before the election, a continuing resolution. There was no interest or appetite to reprise what we went through last year with shutting down the government. So a continuing resolution was enacted that expired December 11th. And the general consensus among the appropriations committees, both Republicans and Democrats, both House and Senate, was that we were going to do an omnibus appropriations bill with as many as the 12 appropriation bills in that omnibus as we could. Everyone knew that some of those bills were easier to put in an omnibus than others. Most notably the labor HHS education bill, which of course has a number of our priorities in it, is always the most contentious among the domestic policy bills, and always was going to be a long shot as to whether agreement could be reached around that bill. There were some that were pushing simply for a continuing resolution, particularly on the Republican side, beyond the Appropriations Committee. The thought was, we have the majority come January. Why not do a continuing resolution, take us into the majority, and then we can do the bills the way we want to. Frankly, and candidly, I think leadership in both chambers really wanted to start with a clean slate. They didn't want leftover items from this year that they'd have to start working on next year. So even folks like Mitch McConnell and Speaker Boehner were pretty vocal, at least initially, in talking about wanting to do an omnibus. And then we had the Immigration Executive Order. And there was a lot of talk about, well, we can't allow funding for Department of Homeland Security to go through. The president has to be punished in some way for that executive order. And thus was born a new word in Washington called a omnibus, which is what happens when you mix a continuing resolution and an omnibus appropriations bill and smush it together. So what we have is a largely an omnibus appropriations bill that, shockingly enough, has funding details for 11 of the 12 subcommittees, including the Labor HHS Education Committee, and a continuing resolution for the Department of Homeland Security that runs through the end of February. And this was determined to be the best option available, and a way to send a message to the administration around the immigration order while still funding the government and being able to start largely with a clean slate. So some of the highlights for the priorities that we care about, it really was a mixed bag. I would note that the overall funding level in the entire bill was essentially flat compared to last year. So anything that saw even a slight increase really is something to note and to be to take note of and to be appreciative of. That said, NSF, NASA, and Defense Basic Research will all see at least modest increases next year. The defense research accounts are particularly noteworthy because the administration had proposed about 7% cuts to defense basic research. And instead of a 7% cut, we're going to see a very slight increase. A number of programs were flat funded: Department of Energy's Office of Science, most of the federal student aid programs, Institute of Education Sciences, etc. NIH is listed as a decrease. It actually got about a $150 million increase, but out of the $30 billion total budget for NIH, that does not even keep up with the rate of inflation. So NIH, unfortunately, is probably the largest disappointment from our perspective in the omnibus. And it did include most of what the administration requested in the way of supplemental funding related to Ebola. Much of that is for Department of Defense efforts in Africa, as well as some of the HHS CDC efforts. There are pieces that include some research funding, both through NIH as well as through DARPA and DITRA at DOD. So the omnibus passed the House last Thursday, before the continuing resolution expired. The House also passed a very short 2-day continuing resolution to give the Senate presumably enough time to pass the bill later that week or over the weekend and get it to the President to sign. It quickly became apparent that our usual obstructionists in the Senate, Senators Lee and Senators Cruz, were not going to allow the bill to proceed in any kind of speedy fashion, and in fact raised a constitutional point of order against the omnibus, saying that it was unconstitutional. That point of order was roundly defeated on Saturday, a rare Senate session over the weekend. And the bill was ultimately passed late on Saturday night by a bipartisan 56-40 vote. So it is on its way to be signed by the president, but not without much added drama and quite a bit of delay. So when they finally do get out of here, they'll recess until January 6th, and then we'll have the 114th Congress convene. Just a quick kind of look ahead to next year, some key dates that we have facing us. There's a couple of major issues that we have the first half of next year. Technically, mid-March, the debt ceiling expires once again. You may recall some of those battles of recent years. However, the Department of Treasury can start implementing their so-called extraordinary measures, which will likely bring them until sometime in June, when Congress will actually have to deal with the debt limit. Also, the end of March, of particular interest to Vanderbilt and our medical center, the current Medicare physician payment patch expires at the end of March, and that will likely trigger some sort of substantial hospital package in March. And then we have a number of other things that will be consuming a lot of Congress's attention. Highway Trust Fund, potential Supreme Court decision that will have could have a significant impact on the Affordable Care Act, and some other authorizations that expire that are seen as must-address issues for Congress next year. Unless we forget, January 18th and 26th, 2016, starts the presidential primaries and caucuses. So just looking ahead at one of the big things that you may have heard folks talking a lot about, and that's this idea of reconciliation. This is something, a procedural process that Congress can employ basically to affect revenue changes, whether it's increases or decreases, changes to the budget that have a fiscal impact. There are very strict rules for how a reconciliation package proceeds legislatively through particularly the Senate, and the big attraction to it is that you only need a majority to pass a reconciliation bill in the Senate, and they are not subject to filibuster. So this is seen in a new Republican Congress as a very attractive mechanism to achieve their policy priorities. One of the big questions will be whether, if they choose to use reconciliation, whether they will go after sort of the traditional Republican red meat of overturning, reversing Obamacare, and some of those types of things, which inevitably the president will veto, or whether they will see it as an opportunity to potentially compromise and make some policy proposals that might actually have the support of the administration. So lots of questions on how they might use that, but there certainly are instances in the recent past of a divided Congress and administration reaching agreement on fairly substantial policy changes through the reconciliation measures. So other things that we will be paying attention to next year, on the higher ed side, the Higher Education Act is up for reauthorization still. So that's something that we're expecting Chairman Alexander to pay a lot of attention to and to try to start moving. On the research side, to close the innovation deficit, something that AAU and a number of the other research associations and organizations have been championing, epitomized in the America Competes Act, will continue to be topics of conversations and things that we pay attention to. And lastly, the House Energy and Commerce Committee has, over the past year, launched this so-called 21st Century Cures initiative that we're expecting to see culminate in some legislative proposals next year. So, questions that will dictate how effective perhaps the 114th Congress is. Who's really in control of the Senate? Mitch McConnell, as Alex mentioned, will be the majority leader, but he could have quite a few members of his conference who are running for president and have already proven, just as recently as over the past weekend, not shy about using every procedural mechanism available to them to slow down or be obstructionist to things that they're opposed to in the Senate. We also have a class of freshman senators that Alex has also alluded to that will come in with their own views, their own opinions, their own interest in making Washington squeal, as Senator-elect Ernst alluded to. Can the Republicans govern? They now have control of both chambers of Congress. In theory, they have no excuses for not getting things accomplished. They have a very strong majority in the House. They have a very strong majority in the Senate. They don't have 60 in the Senate, which would really allow them to do whatever they wanted. But in theory, they should be able to push through their agenda. However, as we've certainly seen over the last 2 years in the Republican House, we have a so-called hell no caucus that refuses to let things go through that sort of a broad bipartisan majority and more in the center would agree to. On the other hand, we seem to have an opening and an opportunity for the comeback of more moderate voices on both sides of the aisle, frankly, particularly in the Senate. Senator Alexander is certainly someone that is seen as a practical moderate, not an ideologue, someone who's willing to work across the aisle, as are a number of his colleagues, like Susan Collins from Maine, Angus King, the epitome of a moderate. He's an independent. Joe Manchin from West Virginia, and frankly Mark Warner, given the fact that he barely scraped by in November in Virginia, probably is going to be paying a little bit more attention to both sides of the aisle. And lastly, the big question is, the president has 2 more years left of his term. What is his legacy going to be? Does he want to continue with partisan gridlock and oppose what the Republican Congress might send him? Or is he going to be willing to make a deal? And I would posit that watching the House consider the Cromnibus last Thursday perhaps gives us a little bit of an insight into what that dynamic might look like. It was fascinating from, I think, our perspective, watching last Thursday as debate started on the Cromnibus bill. They barely got the rule governing the debate over the finish line, and then they quickly pulled the bill from consideration of the floor and went into a recess because Speaker Boehner and the Republican leadership realized they didn't have the votes to pass it. And what ensued was several hours, the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, of wrangling and an increasingly evident divide among House Democrats, with Minority Leader Pelosi vehemently opposing the Cromnibus because of policy riders related to the financial services industry, and her number 2 in command, Steny Hoyer from Maryland, supporting the bill as the best package and deal we're going to get, far better than what we might get if we were to wait until January. And then the White House weighing in support of the omnibus, opposing Nancy Pelosi, and frankly the president and the vice president personally making calls to members of the Democratic Conference to try to encourage them to vote for the bill. They barely squeaked by with enough votes around 10 o'clock on Thursday night, and there's a lot of bitterness right now between the left wing of the Democratic Party with Nancy Pelosi and others, and the more moderate wing of the House Democrats, which the president ended up siding with. So perhaps that's a preview of how things might play out next year. We'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, well, thank you, Alan and Christina and Alex. I have to say, these presentations, when we do these, always just make me feel so good and confident about things in Washington. So, this is the time when we open it up for questions, and we'd like to have a conversation going. So I have some questions ready, but I'd much prefer to hear from you all.
I was just hoping to get some clarification, Christina, about the situation with the Cromnibus. So first of all, if I understand correctly, we're talking about the fiscal year that begins October 1, 2015.
No.
No.
The fiscal year that began already October 1, 2014. The current fiscal year.
Current fiscal year, okay. So that's the first clarification. And secondly, does this basically mean that the funding agencies, NSF, NASA, NIH, et cetera, now have budgets effectively? I understand we have to wait for the president's signature. Is that
Correct. Once the president signs it into law, yes, they have their budgets, and presumably they'll start making some decisions on how they want to allocate those budgets.
And then finally, this reconciliation thing that you mentioned, do I understand correctly, with that process, if it ends up being activated, could further modify the
It's more likely to look at things like entitlement programs or taxes than specific policies within further research agencies. Because the hook for a reconciliation bill is that it has to have a fiscal impact. So it's harder to use it to make policy changes at NSF, for instance.
So the agencies have their budgets.
Yes.
I know, just, you didn't mention it specifically, but the last major piece of legislation
Yeah.
that was passed for reconciliation was the Affordable Care Act. So significant things can happen as a result of reconciliation.
These are questions from the health sphere, and the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Trust, CORE, is a big source of funding for health services researchers. And my world is concerned because they see a CAO report that's going to come out about the CORE, and it seems like this is sort of an irresistible opportunity for Republicans maybe to kill the CORE. Are you hearing anything about that, or do you have any projections or thoughts on that?
So there have been some articles that are coming out specifically related to, and they're getting into some comparative effectiveness research, in which Republicans generally aren't a big fan of. In fact, very high-profile issues like hepatitis C medications. I think there's always been the danger that Republicans would try and take a swipe at the core, but as you know, Peter, the funding mechanism isn't through annual appropriations. And so this was a mandatory funding stream that was created through the Affordable Care Act. So I wouldn't say that anywhere close to the top of the list when you're talking about ACA modifications that the Republican conferences on both sides, both chambers would want to attack. The things you're hearing more is modification, repeal of the medical device tax, for example, and
The 30-hour work week,
right.
moving that to 40 hours.
What about the iPad?
Well, yes. In fact, I'm glad you brought that up. The Cromnibus did include a $10 million rescission to iPad. So the Independent Payment Advisory Board, which was created by the Affordable Care Act, which has actually not come into being yet. It's not been formulated and they've not called up its members. And it's a mechanism that would be triggered depending upon Medicare cost growth, and if it goes over a certain threshold, this group, IPAD, would be charged with creating a number of different suggestions on how you could rein in that growth, including potentially cuts to providers, which has not been terribly popular with Republicans, and groups like AMA, the DOTS, have been very active since day one of passage of the Affordable Care Act and trying to gin up support for repeal of IPAD. Very kind of wonky in the weeds issue, but that's a perfect example of something that already Republicans have had some success in whittling away at.
So it's not killed.
It's not killed. They have a $10 million rescission to IPAD's budget.
Other questions? Jessica?
So what do you think Alexander's approach is going to be to the reauthorization? Is it going to be, I guess, chunk-sized pieces or more like...
So if you listen to his speeches, he uses a lot of the same phrases, or his, when he speaks at hearings, he talks a lot about starting from scratch and throwing it all away and starting anew. He talks a lot about weeding the garden, particularly when it comes to regulations, which all sound really great and make for good kind of talking points. Frankly, it's much harder to have this idea of how do you start from scratch from a staff and legislative perspective. You know, earlier this fall, I heard his staff talking about wanting to try and move it in more of a piecemeal approach. And certainly we've seen him already introduce his FAST Act, which would simplify a lot of the federal student aid programs, and the FAFSA certainly. And that was kind of his first chunk, if you will, of reauthorization, rather than going the route of Chairman Harkin of releasing an 800-page comprehensive reauthorization bill. And he may still try to do that, But frankly, when it comes time to actually getting something onto the Senate floor and across the Senate floor, the way the Senate works and the amount of time that legislative packages can take up on the floor, I would say it's highly unlikely that you'd see pieces of HEA move through the Senate once you get to that point. I think at that point it's more likely to see things kind of bundled into one HEA bill.
And last time around that took, what, 5 or 6
Yeah.
years?
Yeah.
So we're anticipating a similar timeline?
Well, we're already into, I think, 2 years past
Right,
when
right.
it's expired technically.
Yeah.
So maybe just 3 to go. Now, I've also heard the staff have been pretty clear that they want to start with ESEA, the K-12, whatever comes after No Child Left Behind. And when they initially said we wanted to start with K-12, my thought was, okay, well that means HEA probably won't be considered next year. And then the staff have made comments of we'll get to HEA by the summer. So I don't know I don't know what the timing is going to look like, but they are clear they want to start with K-12 rather than higher ed.
And one more. It's the updates to the CQ report, which came out last week about maybe moving to a national accreditation system versus
Yes.
a regional. Is that getting any traction? I mean,
Senator Alexander is definitely interested in some bold proposals when it comes to accreditation and looking at are there significant changes that are needed. I haven't talked to his staff specifically about the NSEKI recommendations yet, but it will be interesting to see what their reaction is.
So there have been some fairly aggressive reevaluations of the peer review process, the congressional oversight. Any news about that?
You're right, particularly from a certain Chairman Smith of the House Science Committee, who has it's certainly an apt description to say there's been aggressive oversight by that committee of the National Science Foundation. I don't think that will abate anytime soon. I do think that NSF has taken some steps in the last few weeks with respect to some new requirements around grant proposals and plain English language summaries and abstracts and those sorts of things that frankly have been fairly well received by Chairman Smith. So I think we are hopeful that perhaps we're getting to a point where there's more and better dialogue between the foundation and the House Science Committee. But I don't think that we're going to see the Science Committee and frankly others, mainly in the House, back off of the scrutiny, particularly around social science research and some of the grant titles. Climate change has been another popular target.
I'd say why it's not as pronounced at all compared to the attacks in NSF. There's some danger that this is going to bleed over into NIH as well. You've already seen a little bit of an uptick in some questions from individual members of Congress. Is NIH picking the right kind of grants? This sounds really funny. I don't know if this is really what our taxpayer dollars should be going towards. And of course, none of us are of an interest to have politicians making those decisions and making the scientific decisions that the peer review process is designed to adjudicate.
Peter?
Yeah, given the change in the House and Senate, or more in the Senate, is there any sense of an appetite for war going into next year with ISIS and all that, or how do you see that? I mean, to me, that's the big thing that's still out there that could be. Does the ours in the House and Senate, does that increase the likelihood or decrease the likelihood? Or is it just...
I would just say that, as Christina mentioned, Ash Carter has been nominated by the President to be the next Secretary of Defense. While I think everybody seems to love Ash, Republicans and Democrats alike, I think he will have a fairly easy confirmation process. There will be a lot of conversations in his confirmation hearing about ISIS, about emerging threats, and we might have a better sense after that process if the hawks are going to be very aggressive.
The other thing that I would note is, lest we all forget, we're still in an era of sequestered budgets. So even though we're not seeing the same kind of across-the-board budget cuts that we saw a few years ago, we still are under sequester. They're just lowering the overall allocations. And one of the potentials with increased pressure in this area and others is the defense budget has been under an enormous squeeze. Will there be efforts to try and break those budget caps for the Department of Defense to give them some relief? Which, while that might help in terms of our defense research numbers, what does that mean if we break the budget caps on the defense side? Do we also get to break the budget caps on the non-defense side? Or do we have further inequity between the defense and the non-defense accounts? And that's been, one of our strongest advocacy points over the last few years has been able to work collaboratively with the defense sector to talk about increasing the budget caps across the board and maintaining that parity between defense and non-defense.
I think
Do you have any thoughts?
I think another thing to think about is that if we think about the most recent elections, it's illustrated really nicely with the imagery we had up there a few minutes ago. Foreign policy, defense issues, ISIS, these weren't real banner-waving issues in most congressional campaigns, especially among the newly elected Republicans. The extent to which people are really trying to put the flag in the speak is focusing entirely on domestic policy priorities and, extreme circumstances waging war against the Obama administration, so to speak. So my sense would be that, at least of the newly elected freshmen in the House and the Senate, the extent to which they're going to be engaging in foreign policy, it's going to be very much from a reactive position rather than trying to put themselves forward to try to create a name for themselves. And likewise, I would also think for any of the incumbent senators who are likely running for higher office in the near future, they're not going to be trying to make a name for themselves in the presidential arena by trying to engage foreign policy in this regard.
Other question, Dawn?
Question for Alan. So how's your book been received on Capitol Hill? Particularly, I'm interested in the re-elected ineffectives.
Right. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, well, ironically, Lamar Smith, Chairman Smith, in the 112th Congress, he has the highest score in our legislative effectiveness metrics. So that was interesting. We knew it already, but we didn't really have a sense of how well or how it was received in any regard until one of the staffers contacted us to let us know that he was actually highlighting this on his homepage, which then I had many colleagues asking me to discuss with him his perspective on the NSF. So what we found is generically the people who score quite high, members have been very excited to emphasize this, and members who score quite low, we haven't really drawn attention to that because, as many of you who know me, I'm really a glass half full kind of guy. But it's more the sense that we haven't really drawn attention to who are the low scores. Interestingly enough, this actually came up in some congressional debates between incumbents and challengers. Largely because Vanderbilt and the University of Virginia actually had a precedent at the National Press Club in mid-October where we rolled out the website, which for those of you who might be interested, it's thelawmakers.org, as well as the book. And we had some extremely conscientious and really impressive journalists there from a variety of outlets, and some of which were from regional bureaus looking at. And interestingly enough, some of them focused on their incumbent members in a way that was either quite complimentary or less so. So Congressman Long from Missouri in particular was picked out by, or identified by the Gannett Press as not being highly effective. That ended up being picked up substantially within his congressional race. The incumbent governor of Indiana as well, who's been discussing a potential presidential run, he was also highlighted by Gannett writers as not having had the most distinguished legislative career according to our scores. His chief of staff corresponded that myself and my co-author obviously know nothing about how Congress works. I was happy to be silent. So, generically, it's people who score well, they're happy to embrace it.
Alan, can you talk about why you just focused on the House? You mentioned that.
Yeah. And actually, it builds quite nicely on the point that Christina raised vis-a-vis the unanimous consent agreements. The House, by its very nature, is extremely structured in the sense that it's governed by rules, as the Senate is as well. But for all intents and purposes, day-to-day legislative procedure in the House follows a very transparent sequence of events, all of which can be quite easily documented. And as a researcher, it's very it's reasonably innocuous for us to say, well, essentially if you either do something and it actually receives mark of the committee or actually passes out of committee, that is likely correlated with the amount of effort that someone put in to move these things through. In the Senate, even though there actually is a rule book for all intents and purposes, it's disregarded almost always. I mean, essentially, the Senate is basically run for the most part by unanimous consent agreements or various other ad hoc issues that come up. And some of the ways in which we explicitly try to account for or measure the scope of effort going to legislation wouldn't really translate particularly well to the Senate. I mean, the most straightforward example of this is due to standing rules of the Senate, you could essentially bypass committee and get things onto the floor without any vote per se, which the way we measure effectiveness in the House, the fact you get something reported out of committee, by definition, you're essentially scoring higher than someone who doesn't. But for all intents and purposes, when it gets onto the floor of the Senate, it's up to the majority leader to handle scheduling. So Ted Cruz actually at one point had quite a bit of legislation that had, formally been reported out of committee in the Senate or bypassed committee. But for all intents and purposes, there's no way that Senator Reid was ever going to bring this up for consideration. So that it essentially means something different in the Senate than is in the House, and rather than engage in, at least for the moment, a lot of ad hoc hand-wavy assumptions, try to motivate analysis, we want to start off in the House and see what we could understand across the span of 40 years.
Good, thank you. One last question. We'll be cognizant of your time. No? Okay. Well, please join me in thanking